the U.S. policy towards Europe has had a disastrous effect on European economies. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, the pressure to cut trade ties, trade links with China, the near complete severing of economic links with Russia. It's all been very much to the detriment of Europe. Europe has really suffered, and actually, a weak Europe is not to the benefit of the U.S. A prosperous Europe, that we could trade with and support us, in various international venues and so on, is to our advantage. But by weakening Europe, we really haven't made ourselves more prosperous. It doesn't work that way. Economics is not a zero-sum game. It's not win-lose. It's really win-win. And a prosperous Europe would have actually added to the prosperity of the U.S. So actually, if the Europeans kind of, defeat the globalists within Europe and become more independent, become truly sovereign nations again, I don't think that it hurts the U.S. Again, we've talked about that. It's just like, it's actually, the empire is not something that has made the U.S. stronger and more prosperous. It's quite the reverse. And if we just let that empire grow, it would actually be to our own benefit.
You mean not let the empire grow?
Okay, yeah, I meant to say let it go, not grow.
Let it go. Right.
Let it go. Right.
Yeah, let Europe go and grow independently and trade. Normally, a prosperous Europe that we can not have to control is to our benefit. We'll see if that happens. But something else that I've been seeing that's kind of fits in the same type of framework is that I'm sure you saw the news that Indonesia has become a full member of BRICS. And then when I hear that, I'm not so sure how to take what that means when a country has become a full member of BRICS. In my mind, I'm looking at it as there are two big teams now in the world. There is the multipolar team, the one run by essentially Beijing and Moscow, the BRICS team, versus the U.S. global hegemony, U.S. empire team. And then when a country joins BRICS, I'm thinking of it as they are making a firm statement that I am exiting this U.S. empire game, turning my back on this, and putting my foot firmly in the camp of the new multipolar world. Is that the best way to look at it in terms of this framework, that this is really the significance of BRICS and what it means when countries become full members or partners of BRICS?
I don't think that's overstating it. My understanding is that if you become a member of BRICS, part of becoming a member of BRICS is saying that you're not going to, impose sanctions on other parties. And so you have, to at least to some extent, you have declared yourself independent of the U.S. Now, again, BRICS is really it's not a team in the same way. They don't have a hegemonic vision. They don't have a unified vision of, what we're about, what our ideology is. But it is about, right, sovereignty and independence from saying that, that becoming a member of BRICS is let's say at least it's a step away from dependence on the U.S. and towards independence and sovereignty. I think that's what we would have to see in the case of Indonesia. Indonesia, for a long time, was kind of a very faithful vassal of the United States. And I think this is a signal that they are stepping away from that. Sort of like, again, Saudi Arabia is doing something similar. We don't know what Saudi Arabia, actually, its relationships to the BRICS is right now, but they've at least taken a step towards the BRICS. Now, India has become a full member. Not India, but rather Indonesia has become a full member. And that is a statement that they're making a very serious step towards becoming non-aligned. And they are saying that, okay, we are no longer vassals. We're no longer kind of faithful servants of the U.S.
Right. Yeah, these two conflicts, I think, have been the most damaging thing imaginable to the U.S. empire. Because I imagine Indonesia is the countries all through the global south have been watching what's happening in Ukraine.
Hmm.
But they've also been seeing what we've been doing in Gaza, how we
Yeah.
support Israel. And, Indonesia is a Muslim country,
Yeah.
predominantly so. And, how we just continue to support Israel and say there's nothing going on when there's a genocide being live streamed, especially across the Muslim world. They're much more in tune with it.
Right.
Do you think it's these two things that are primarily moving countries to join BRICS? And that's why we're seeing this huge, we just juxtaposed what's happening
Yeah.
in BRICS nations versus what, we're just talking about Western Europe, how it seems like every Western European government's in crisis in some sort. Whereas,
Yeah.
BRICS is the opposite. It's
Right. Yeah, I think there's no question that the two wars have had a huge impact on the world, on the way the global majority looks at the United States and and Europe, and it's affected their ties with the United States and Europe. There's no question about it. Another factor is just the relative economic decline of the U.S. too, and the rise of China, and and we have to say of Russia too, that Russia actually is showing robust growth. India is doing quite well too. So it's just I think if you look at growth rates of the BRICS nations compared to the G7 now, it's got to be stronger in BRICS.
do you think that it's fair and correct to say that our sanctions on Russia has actually helped the Russian economy?
Um, well, it's hard. That seems to almost defies economic logic. But the truth is that after, well, I guess the economy contracted some in 2022. There were predictions that it would contract by 20% or more, and that didn't happen. It may have been like 1 or 2%. It wasn't much, and then they turned around. They grew a bit, I think, last year, in 2023, and then quite a bit. In 2024, they had strong growth close to 4%. Which is very significant. It's hard to argue, with those statistics. Um, at the same time, in general, like I've said, when you have economic, relations, it's something that's mutually beneficial. So if you end those relations for non-economic reasons, like which is what happened when the West imposed sanctions on Russia, and more than and those relations, those direct relationships, they've tried to interfere with their trade relations with other countries, and they continue to do that. That has to harm Russia to some extent, um, but doesn't seem to have harmed them very much. And there may be something to. I think there may have been sort of like a mindset within Russia that it's like, oh, the West is superior, and somebody we have to rely on them. Their technology is better, their cars are better, their perfumes are better, their cheese is better. And when um, a lot of it, I think, was just sort of a lot of maybe of what Europe sold to Russia was really it wasn't necessarily any better, but it just had that kind of snob appeal or something. So when the sanctions were imposed, and you can no longer buy French cheese or something in Russia. Okay, well, it turns out actually Russian cheesemakers can do it themselves, and that's what Russians have discovered. And I think probably in that and many other cases, it actually has been to the benefit of Russia. Where they were forced to discover, hey, yeah, we can do this too. We didn't have to get the French version or the Italian version or whatever. We can make it just as good, or it's maybe very nearly as good. In some cases, maybe they find out they can make it better. And I think that's what Russians, it's been a kind of an awakening within Russia. It's really made Russians more confident, and you realize that, okay, yeah, we're not the inferior party.
Right.
They did have something of an inferiority complex before.
Right, or they're able to, get it from China if they don't do it
Yeah,
themselves,
well, that's true.
and
Right.
at a,
Yeah, I
probably a
think like in
fraction of the
many.
cost.
Yeah, right. Like for example, with like maybe before they still buy iPhones or whatever, but there was a reliance on Apple products or whatever. And the fact is, and I think they still get them, but the fact is that the Chinese can make those just as well, if not better, at a fraction of the cost. And it's really just sort of a prestige thing. I've got an iPhone. Yeah, well, you know, Huawei makes
Well, right. Huawei, Xiaomi, or
yeah,
makes
Xiaomi,
really good.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah, I think maybe what happened is that, when these sanctions got placed, there was that initial contraction, but it ended up kind of reinvigorating the global south. Kind of when they saw what was happening, these assets frozen, they're like, whoa, okay. Then it strengthened these economic ties between Russia and all these other countries. And it started paving these new pathways that I think
yeah,
other countries are finding beneficial, and realizing that we don't need the U.S., we don't need the Western world. And that in itself may be the most crippling, damaging thing to
yeah.
the U.S. empire.
Right. Yeah, no, this right. The launch of the SMO, and probably even more importantly, the Western reaction to it, has had a huge impact on the world. And I think the most significant part of that impact is what you just described.
Is there a recognition now, at least from the West, that these sanctions have failed?
Um, it not officially. It comes out like even in the New York Times, okay, in the Washington Post. These major news outlets do have articles in which various officials or think tank personnel do admit that, hey, it really hasn't worked. But it's kind of like it's not being shouted from the rooftops. It hasn't been made part of the official narrative. It's just being kind of whispered on the sidelines. This isn't really working out. But you won't get a leading U.S. politician to go out and say that. I mean, the official, the official position is that it's hurt Russia already, and it's actually greatly weakened their economy. And with one more sanction, the Russian economy is going to collapse. That's what you hear, and what you've been hearing for the last 2 or 3 years.
Right. Yeah. And the world has changed so much in the past 3 years. Just when I think about the position of the United States prior to the SMO, it was just completely different. I still had this idea, there's still this sort of consensus of U.S. primacy in the world.
Right. Yeah,
And
no,
it's
again,
completely gone now.
Yeah, it's changed my own perceptions. I knew that Russia wasn't a gas station masquerading as a country, that kind of thing. I knew that was ridiculous. I knew that Russia had a diverse and relatively strong economy even, back then. But I kind of assumed, again, because you look at the statistics, Russia, even when you use purchasing power parity, PPP to measure the economy, which is really the right way to measure an economy. It tells you what the real economy is. It is the 4th largest in the world, but still the U.S. is so far ahead. And when you combine all of Europe, the two of them together, still are greatly are much larger than the Russian economy. And just looking at that, I kind of assumed that Russia really couldn't take on NATO in the long run, and that's turned out to be false. That's actually to my surprise too. I mean that clearly these statistics, they're hiding something. They're not revealing the full reality. And I think we see it when we're talking about productive capacity. And maybe much of the Western economies have value, but it's kind of it's a value of intangible services and finance and that kind of thing. But it's not a value that reflects real things, and real production.
Right. Yeah, every day that goes by where we're involved in these conflicts in Ukraine and the support of Israel and the genocide in Gaza, I think it just becomes more and more apparent to the world that, well, we're more morally bankrupt for one, but that also that we don't have primacy. We can't, all of our tools for subjugation no longer work. the economic sanctions, the threats
Right.
of military or
Yeah.
regime change.
Right.
We're seeing regime changes fail now. It's becoming,
Yeah.
it just, the mask is falling off. We've talked about that before.
Yeah,
And I just feel like as it continues to go along, more and more people will wake up and come to the same realization that we have come to, just observing these conflicts over the past 2-3 years is just more and more people are going to have their eyes open. And so that trend of the U.S. empire losing its position or people becoming aware of its true position in the world is just going to accelerate. It's just going to continue. And there's nothing to turn that around.
Right. Well, I do have to point out one exception to the to your statement, your assertion that the U.S. can't, bring about regime change, and that's Syria. That's one place. That was a country that they brought down. Of course, they had two very powerful allies in this effort, both Turkey and Israel. And Syria was a war-torn and, a small, poor country. And they physically seized a large part of the territory, the most economically valuable part of Syrian territory. So, it is an exceptional case, but they did bring it down. One statistic that I heard recently, I knew that Syria was in bad shape, but I didn't realize how bad the conditions were there. I think just prior to the collapse, in the years leading up to the collapse, the Syrian economy was only 15% of what it had been before the insurrection began back in 2011.
Oh my goodness.
15%.
Wow.
And it wasn't a very wealthy country to begin with. So that's, and when you think back to that, you kind of understand why it collapsed as rapidly as it did. It wasn't.
Right.
Of course, they were getting some support, like Iran was providing fuel and Russia was providing wheat, but it just couldn't make up for that 85% that they lost, anywhere close to it.
Right. I mean, the U.S. sort of set it up for the regime change, but in a large part it was Turkey more than anything. So it's not a clear cut, on the regime change. I actually saw something. I believe it was on RT. I just read the headline just this morning, right before we started, saying that Israel fears that it could be come into conflict with Turkey. Do you believe that there's something to that? There's something there? I mean,
yeah. Well, there's potential. Again, they're pretty far away. I mean, Israel's down in southern Syria and probably will stay down there. Turkey's up in northern Syria and probably will stay up there.
But Turkey,
but in eastern Syria, they are, they have conflicting interests. I think clearly that Israel wants the U.S. to stay there and the Kurds to remain independent there, the YPG, and Turkey does not. So there is a potential for some kind of conflict. We'll see what happens. Again, I'm afraid it may be just the end of Syria. I don't think that Syria is ever going to be put back together again.
Isn't HTS, this Al-Jawlani guy, isn't he essentially Erdogan's puppet? I mean, and so in a sense that is Turkey, and then it's kind of weird. I don't understand what Al-Jawlani's deal is. First, I think he knows he's in a precarious position, and that's why he says he's not going to attack the Israelis now. But then he's also asking the Russians to stay. And it's just the whole thing is just.
Well, again, I think the reason he's asking the Russians to stay and he's being careful not to attack the Russians, clearly some order went down, don't touch the Russians. Because the Russians were all over. Yeah, exactly. It's Erdogan. Because I think Erdogan backstabbed the Russians, but he also understands that his relationship with Russia is very important to Turkey. And so he just has, he has to make it up to the Russians in a way, that's partly, and it doesn't really cost him anything. So why not just make sure that, that all his, the HTS and these other jihadist groups there make sure that the order goes out that they don't hurt Russians. That's kind of a low cost way of paying back the Russians, or trying to reestablish it's never going to be a friendship, but the relationship between Russia and Turkey. He's saying he wants the Russians to stay, and I think it's just because of Erdogan. I think the Russians are going to leave, or they're going to leave in all but name. I think it would be wise for them to leave. I think staying there they would be making a mistake similar to what the Americans have made in Iraq. They just become a target. There's really nothing they can do. I think that those bases do have some value to them. For example, they do have radar installations and early detection systems that are helpful to the defense of Russia. And to Iran too, so maybe there's a case for them, remaining there, retaining some kind of limited presence. Interestingly, Mearsheimer has a different theory. I go with the theory basically. The reasons that Jolani is saying, oh, please Russians stay. It's Erdogan behind it. Erdogan wants them to stay for various reasons, but Mearsheimer says that we might actually see some kind of like a alliance develop within Syria, like between HTS, the Russians, and Turkey, against the Americans and the Kurds in eastern Syria, because I think Jolani is going to realize is that, like, okay, yeah, why did Assad fall? It was partly because, again, the oil fields and the wheat fields were under American Kurdish control. We need to get that back. We're not strong enough to get that back on our own. So, we need maybe Russia and Turkey to help us to get it back. But I don't think the Russians really want to get involved in it. I don't think they're going to actually help HTS. So I don't see that happening.
Yeah, it's strange because I don't know which side HTS and Erdogan's on fully. Because if we had this Operation Timber Sycamore, it's what we started that video off with,
right?
To remove al Assad. We finally did it, and then we got somebody that you're saying that, or Mearsheimer is saying that was potentially wanting to remove the Kurds in the U.S. Out of there. We just hurt ourselves, but that's par for the course. Every move we do does seem to backfire and end up hurting America. But clearly that's not our intention.
Right.
We wanted the Russians out. We wanted chaotic Syria. I guess the Israelis got what they wanted.
It was Israel. We really do the Israeli bidding in the Middle East, and it's what Israel wants. Israel wants a chaotic, divided Syria, and they got it. And it's not to the benefit of the U.S., but it is to the benefit of Israel. Probably, some people argue that it'll come back to bite Israel. I really don't see that. Not anywhere in the foreseeable future. I think it really has been to the benefit of Israel.
Do you think that as long as Israel's around, we will always be beholden to Israel and our foreign policy, at least with regards to the Middle East? That's...
Yeah, unfortunately, barring some sort of, even a disaster, I think it's just like the ties, the devotion to Israel at both the elite and the popular level are just so strong. We've spoken about there are disturbing trends, from a Zionist perspective. They're disturbing. The younger generation, mostly on the left, but not entirely. Even on the right, there is a drift away from Israel, and that may mean trouble down the road.
I can tell you what, that trend's going to explode and accelerate if Trump gets us into a conflict with Iran. Because people will realize that why are we doing this? That this is because Netanyahu wants this. Want to use
if
the
American
US.
soldiers start to come back in body bags, and then it really will. I mean, if it's just an air war, it just stays limited. People can watch it on TV and be entertained by it. But if it means the loss of American life in any significant numbers, it will be a real problem.